amount to think about here. I want to open it up to questions, but I know as people think about that a little bit, I wanted to ask one myself. I'm very encouraged by this idea of OBOR as a development strategy and a way to form markets and that sort of thing to keep the global economy moving, and that being a very key part of globalization with Chinese characteristics. But we talked about this a little bit at lunch prior. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish between this sort of perfect world of economists and economic policy and political objectives that intervene. So how can we make that distinction? Clearly, with OBOR in particular, there are some political objectives to it. It's not just a development strategy. The places where China's deciding to invest, the sort of conditions on investment, the political interchange between the political leadership in China and the political leaderships of the countries where it plans to invest. The types of investments it makes. There's political issues around the overcapacity in some of these areas where China's trying to take advantage of this and actually turn what would be a problem that is producing so much steel and aluminum that it hurts other markets. They're turning that into a virtue by trying to export it in developed markets overseas. So how can we sort out what's good economics behind OBOR, what's a good development strategy, and what is just politics or part of a foreign policy? Maybe, Justin, you can start us.
This is a very good question, and it reminds me of a paper I published at the Cato Journal in 1989, and the title is An Economic Theory of Institutional Changes. And subtitle is Imposed Changes and Induced Changes. Imposed changes certainly are motivated by political purpose to change the institution and to achieve political goal. But imposed change will not bring in the expected result if there's no economic rationality behind that. And if you have economic rationalities, then you're going to have induced changes, although time may take longer. So similarly, in a daily life, certainly we have politics, and the politician pursues certain goals to meet its, her, or his personal objective. But those kind of political purpose cannot be sustained if there's no economic rationality behind that. So I think that is the balance we need to keep. And also the reason why we need to study this. We need to have a better understanding what are the driving force economically behind the changes, and use this kind of knowledge to inform politicians. So when they pursue their political goal, they can satisfy their personal objective, but at the same time make a contribution to the improvement of the society.
Yeah, so really the success of OBOR depends on its integrity in some ways. Right. Is it? Yeah. Anyone else want to address that?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Justin since I published his article. But
you are the editor. And that's a big article in that journal.
Yeah. I think the idea of looking at the structure of the economy and institutions is extremely important. And the economics profession for a long time kind of left out the idea of institutions and property rights. That was brought into being by people like Ronald Coase and Doug North and other people. So I'm glad we're getting back to that. I would just like to make one comment where Wen Yi said that the market is a public good. Well, the public good is typically defined by what? Non-rival consumption and non-excludability. Well, markets do just the opposite. Prices basically exclude people, and there's private property rights. Markets require private property rights. So the basis of a market system is private property rights. You're exchanging, as Armin Elshin said, you're exchanging bundles of rights. The rights that go with private property are the rights to use it, and in particular, the right to transfer it or sell it, the right of saleability. So when you sell things, you basically, in a capital market, if it's a well-functioning capital market, the value, the sale value, will reflect expected future value of the property discounted to the present. That's the function of the interest rate. So if you don't have a competitively determined interest rate and private property rights for a capital market, you can't have real capital markets, or what we might call pseudo-capital markets. And that's one problem China's had because of the lack, they still have a legacy of central planning in the financial sector. Credit is still heavily allocated. All the big banks are state-owned banks. And I always say the SOBs lend to the SOEs. People I talk to in China are well aware of this, especially at the central bank. But it's driven more by politics than by economics. Good economists understand the problems, but there's political barriers. Of course, the central bank in China is not independent. It reports to the state council. So these are institutional problems again. So I think it makes more sense instead of saying that the market is a public good, to say that there's positive externalities from developing markets, and they depend upon property rights. You have to have a legal system. You have to have government enforce those laws. So I'm not saying there's no need for government, but I think, again, this relationship that Li Keqiang mentioned between the government and the market, that's what we should be thinking about. What's the relationship between the government and the market? If the government's in the way of the market, then markets won't work very well. And I think that's what's happened to a lot of countries around the world, is the governments interfere too much. What China has done is that China's government has gotten out of the way to a large extent, especially in international trade. You might say, well, they're very protectionist. Well, nothing compared to what it was 20, 30 years ago. So we can't fall under the spell of comparing a perfect system with an existing system. We have to look at existing alternatives and try to choose those that we think are best, and make decisions that will support those institutions. That's the hard part.
Did you have something you wanted to say, Phil?
Oh, no. It's
Yeah, please.
Yes, well, I want to thank Jim for the remarks, but still I want to fight back a little bit. Institutions are endogenous. And let me give examples. In Qing Dynasty China, I think there's a consensus among almost all the historians, Western historians, American historians, Chinese historians. Qing Dynasty, the market system was better than Europe, than UK, in terms of protection of private land right. Of China, is the inventor of currency, inventor of a lot of market elements. But the Qing Dynasty had no hope to kickstart the Industrial Revolution, because the government lacked the capacity to support Qing Dynasty merchants to create a global market. When the Dutch merchants, East Indian Company, the UK East Indian Company, used military power, penetrated to South China Sea, the Chinese merchants went to Beijing, asked for help. The merchants say, you're on yourself. It's a market system. And then later on, that's why after 50 years of attempt to industrialize, especially after the Opium War, the monarchy realized it's backward, you need industrialization, but failed. 50 years later, there was a bloody revolution, thinking that the reason Qing Dynasty failed, not because of lack of a market, but lack of political institutions, the modern political institutions. So they copied the US institutions by the Shanghai revolutionaries, and segregation of powers, lots of other forms. But 40 years passed without kickstarting industrial revolution, even though some progress has been made. That's why there was a communism revolution, because of the massive rural area in China in the Republic era was still under extreme poverty. And that's why there's a communist revolution. And after the communists took power, they think, well, we have wasted 100 years or more to try to industrialize using market system in vain without success. Let's use a different system. So they start to adopt social planning. They think that's the way to industrialize China. Of course, 30 years passed, it built some industrial system and improved literacy dramatically, improves people's life expectancy from 38 years to 68 years, but still was not able to kick industrial revolution. So that's why by 1978, China need another round of new trial, new attempt to industrialize. And after Deng Xiaoping, we know that China adopted a sort of mixed system, market plus state-owned factory plus state leadership in market creation, and China started to boom. And along the way, China started to rebuild new institutions based on demand from the market. So institutions are endogenous, are created to protect the fruits of industrialization. And you look at the US history, all the institutions are endogenous built. Financial accounting, lots of market regulations. When we talk about the marketization, privatization, deregulation, liberalization, we constantly forget that developed country, the reason market forces are working so much better than developing country, precisely because of sophisticated regulations. Market forces can be either destructive or productive, depends on how you regulate it. Otherwise, fake goods, fake currency, scandal, fraud running everywhere. In 19th century US, people perhaps do not know, made in US was a bad name. All fake goods, fake medicine, and fake banknotes. 6,000 different kind of fake banknotes was circulating in the US. So that's why in early 20th century, US government set up this Food and Drug Administration system to check on the market forces. And in the US, from food to drugs, from education to Medicare, from healthcare, perhaps to financial system, there's a lot of hidden regulations. That's why we need specialized lawyers. They have volumes and volumes of books to go through. Without this kind of regulatory institutions, it's impossible for market to function, and it takes developing country time and experience to endogenously build those kind of regulatory system institutions. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We could have a subsequent program, just a debate between Dr. Wen and Dr. Dorn. Well, let me open it up to questions. Yeah, right here. We got a microphone for you. Could you direct it to one of the panelists so we can get in plenty of questions?
Greg from Radio Free Asia. This question is to Justin, Dr. Lin. Welcome to Tang. You mentioned about the induced economic change that although for political purposes, but as a whole result, it might do some good for the whole country. So it leads me to think about, are you talking about some famous person on YouTube nowadays, the whistleblower, Mr. Guo Wengui? And then are you talking about the induced political change, economic change? Is it part of the Chinese banking system, financial system, even though there might be some political calculation behind the party congress, but as a whole, that President Xi want to go ahead because of this whistleblower's tip-off? And the second question is, what is your comments on Guo Wengui's accusation? Have you go through line by line of his tip-off to the Chinese leaders? Thank you.
Well, I can answer the first question, and I did not really get your second question. Yeah. For the first question, the Chinese financial system is dominated by big banks and equity markets. And the reason China adopted those kind of financial system is because I mentioned at the beginning of the transition, there was a need to subsidize the capital-intensive, large-scale state-owned enterprises. They were capital-intensive, and before the transition, they did not have to pay any capital cost because all the investment was supported by fiscal appropriation working capitals was supported by fiscal appropriation. And the reason, because they went against China's comparative advantages, firms in those kind of sectors were not viable. Without state protection and subsidies, they cannot survive. To some extent, defense industry in the US also had the same characteristics. They need budget support from the Congress. But after the transition in 1979, China converted from this kind of fiscal appropriation to bank loans, but they cannot pay high cost. So the interest rate need to be suppressed. And also because their scale was large, and so they can only be supported by big banks and the equity markets. But even up to today, 70% of the employment, 60% of GDPs in China are, from small agricultural households, small, medium, or micro size of manufacturing and service sectors. And this kind of financial institutions could not serve those small guys. And so when we talk about deepening financial sector reform, on the one hand, we need to liberalize the interest rate control, but on the other hand, we need to develop those kind of financial institutions which can support the small operations, mainly the small, medium-sized bank in China. So that's the direction of the financial reforms. I did not get your second question, so I can ask.
My second question is about the second question is about the whistleblower's Guo Wengui's tip-off. So do you think that his tip-off do more damage to the Chinese financial system, or doing, like you said, it's just doing more good?
Okay, Guo Wengui. Well, first, I did not follow that. But from the very limited information I received, from Shenzhen and so on, I would say 99% of his accusation was just fiction instead of a reality.
But in concept, do you think the idea of whistleblowers is a good thing for the economy, or is it a bad thing?
Well, whistleblower, if the blower is, had the facts and also had the good intention, then whistleblower should be good. But if the whistleblower create all kind of, fictions and try to, destroy some other people's image. And I think that kind of freedom should be bad for the society. Supposedly, I accuse you of something openly, and then it's spread in the media. And even maybe after a few days, you had the opportunity to clarify that. But the public people, they like to hear the bad stories. They don't like to hear the good stories. And another kind of situation, you are going to have a lot of misperception about you, right? And do you think those kind of freedom is good for you?
Okay, right here in the center, gentleman